So good afternoon and welcome everyone to the OFA Building Code Lunch and Learn. As a general reminder, please ensure that your microphones remain turned off during this presentation because this Lunch and Learn is being recorded, as you saw at the top of your screen, and will be posted publicly on YouTube and the OFA website for those unable to attend or for those who just want to revisit today's content. If you haven't seen or met me before, I'm Duncan Gutza. I work here at the OFA as a policy analyst who focuses on land use planning and farm property issues. Most of my time is dedicated to land use planning specifically and its extended family of legislation, policies, and regulations. So I know that I am very interested to see today's presentation. It's my privilege today to introduce our speaker, Mr. Aaron Stewardson. We're fortunate to have Aaron deliver this presentation as he brings with him over 20 years of experience in working with the Ontario Building Code and several Ontario municipalities. Aaron will be discussing the building code today as it applies to farm structures, buildings, and other construction projects in rural areas. There are recent changes to the code that many of you will be interested to hear about. But before I turn it over to Aaron, I will once again remind everyone who just joined to keep your microphones muted during the presentation, and we will be having a Q&A at the end of this session. However, with the several hundreds of folks who registered to attend today and a desire to keep things organized, we're going to ask that all questions are submitted to the chat box. If we need to clarify your question, we will ask you to unmute and speak aloud. If we don't have time to answer all of today's questions, we will be able to coordinate and answer questions after the lunch and learn. So we'll get on that should that happen. And well, without further ado, please give your undivided attention to Aaron Stewardson. Take it away.
Thanks, Duncan. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Aaron Stewardson. I am Manager of Development Services, Chief Billing Official for the Municipality of Bluewater. And I'm here to talk about some building code changes. So I'll just share my screen here so we can get started. Okay, so welcome everybody. A little bit about me. I've been a building official for 20 years now, and I was previously chair of the local Southwestern chapter of the Ontario Building Officials Association. I've been involved with the Ontario Building Officials for a long time, providing education and training for many individuals around the province. So one thing I wanted to do is give a quick brief history of building codes and farm codes, right? Building codes have been around for a very long time. They're started out as a real reason to protect the health and safety of people, right? We've all heard about Chicago fires in New York, fires over in Britain from decades and centuries ago, right? So this is a lot of the reasons why these standards were created and brought into effect. Farm building code in Canada has been around since the 60s. The current National Farm Building Code was last updated in 1995. And that's the current edition that was being used up until January 31st or January 1st this year, right? And the National Farm Building Code really is a relaxed version of standard building codes for many other buildings. And that is due to the lesser number of people and the lesser health and safety requirements that are needed for these buildings, okay? So currently up until January this year, we're working under the 1995. And that edition, that 1995 Farm Building Code is still gonna come into play for many farm buildings. And we'll talk about that later. So here we are in 2025 and the updates from the 2024 Ontario Building Code, which is a harmonization between national building codes and farm codes, brings in a lot of changes to farm buildings. So previously regulated because of low human occupancy, so there was lesser standard of construction. But the last 2 decades specifically, we've seen a number of changes to farm buildings, both in size, technology, and the use of these buildings. As we know, agricultural buildings have a lot of technology in them, and then they're very advanced buildings. They're not the smaller, simpler barns from centuries ago, right? So now that the 2024 Ontario Building Code is partially harmonized with the National Building Code, some agricultural buildings have been moved to be in the Ontario Building Code depending on the situation. So how do we know which code to use? Because the 1995 National Farm Code is still in effect and the Ontario Building Code is in effect. So essentially, this is the flow chart that has been created. And when we have an agricultural occupancy, right, and it is of low human occupancy, we know we can classify it as a farm building. If it does not meet the test of an agricultural occupancy or does not meet the test of a low human occupancy, then we are put into Part 9 and Part 3 of the Ontario Building Code, which Part 9 is residential houses and smaller buildings, and Part 3 is larger projects, commercial, high rises, those situations. So if we pass the test that is an agricultural use, right, and we pass the test that is a low human occupancy, and then we get into this situation. So this is our deciding factor of whether we are going to be into the Ontario Building Code or if we're going to stay with the National Farm Building Code. So if we are greater than 600 meters squared, so that's 6,400 square feet, or greater than 3 stories in height, or it's a G4 use, and I'll get to the G4 use, we'll talk about that in a bit. Then if we're greater than one of these, or are one of these, then we are under the large farm building requirements under the Ontario Building Code. So that means we're complying with, or you're required to comply with, the new Part 2 of the Ontario Building Code. If we do not meet this test, so we're less than 3 stories, we're less than 6,400 square feet, and we're not a G4, then we can stay with the National Farm Building Code of Canada. So a simple equipment storage shed that is 60 feet by 100 feet is, 6,000 square feet. That's under 600 meters squared. That can still be constructed under the National Farm Building Code. So with this, the code changes, that type of building, there is no change to how the construction would work. The National Farm Building Code of Canada does not refer to the snow loading, seismic loading, and such under the current Ontario Building Code. It refers back to the 1997 Building Code. So when we're dealing with the National Farm Building Code of 1995, we're still using previous snow loading and seismic wind loading conditions. It's only for our large farm buildings now, then we get up into here, over 6,400 square feet, that we are going to hit into the new seismic loading and new snow loading requirements under the Ontario Building Code. So the Ontario Building Code splits up all types of buildings into classifications, and these classifications are standard across Canada. It's not just Ontario. A is assembly, B is care, detention occupancies, which is hospitals and such. C is residential. D, we get into offices. E's are mercantile stores. F's are industrial. And G now is farm occupancies. It would have been nice if F could have been for farm, but F was already taken. So G is the new one. So a G1 building is considered a high hazard agricultural occupancy. So this is a farm building housing livestock with liquid manure underneath. We get into feed mills, grain elevators, or rooms that are for bulk storage of flammable, reactive liquids or materials, right? So this requirement here, this is, if we think about this, the G1 is the highest hazard. It's the highest building that is there for, that needs the most protection, okay? The G3, I've purposely skipped G2. The G3 is our greenhouses. Okay. So G3 uses are greenhouses over the 600 meters squared, right? So these are your typical greenhouses that you see. Not much has changed with these, except now you're into a little bit different for your snow loading for the roofs of them. G4s are agricultural occupancies with no human occupants. Okay, so our grain bins, digesters, storage bins, and it could be vertical, horizontal silos, those types of things that don't have a human occupancy to them normally, right? They do, there is a way for people to be in them, but they're not occupied on a normal basis, right? So these are the G4s. Now, if you remember, the G4s are a situation that um, people don't go in, especially like a bin, and not intended for people to be in them. Okay. Then we get into the G2. So G2 is anything that's not else classified as a G1, 3, or 4. So these are every other barn that doesn't have liquid manure underneath, animal training facilities, um, feed storage, grain, forage, milking facilities, standard equipment storage buildings, workshops, repair shops that are on farm, right? And those situations. So the G2 category is really the one that encompasses majority of farm buildings out there. Um, it allows for the most general makeup as well. So again, so go back to which code to use, right? So depending on the definition of your agricultural occupancy, right? These occupancies determine the type of building and the classification. So depending on what you're using the building for, so if you're equipment storage, repair, something along those lines, you're going to fall under a G2, right? Very simple building design. Until you get into the classification of a G1, that's when you're starting into a little bit more requirements needed. And it really becomes down to it's the protection needed for the people with the liquid manure underneath, right? And it's that chemical aspect that the liquid manure provides to the atmosphere within the building. So all of these elements determine if you're part two of the Ontario Building Code or if you're going to stick under the existing 1995 Farm Code. Okay, so all G4s, so anything that has a grain bin, feed mill, grain elevator, those types of situations are always going to fall under the Ontario Building Code. So those are going to require your larger structural requirements, your seismic requirements, and your higher snow loads, right? Because you're automatically under the Ontario Building Code now. So any building that's not, that could be a G1, G2, or G3 that's under 600 meters squared, could still be under the Farm Building Code, which doesn't affect any changes to anybody at this point. So the one thing with the change of putting large farm buildings into the Ontario Building Code is there are more requirements towards how the buildings are required to be constructed and the elements that need to be within those buildings, right? So new requirements for large farm buildings under the Ontario Building Code, right? So certain buildings will require sprinkler systems based on use, size, or height. It could be any one of those. Generally, it's going to get down to the size, which is your building area, or the height, which is your number of stories. I'll touch on this a little bit later. Fire alarm systems may be required in some large farm buildings based on the occupant load, so the number of people in it. Not too much to be worried here because their occupant load is quite substantial to when the fire alarm is needed, right? And it gets down to the number of stories and if you have a basement in a farm building. Very, very few buildings out there, or very few farm buildings out there, have a basement within them that's going to trigger the need for a fire alarm system. Requirements for firefighting. This is a little bit trickier because this gets down to each and every municipality, right? So because you're under the Ontario building code now, you're actually in a situation that because these are classified as large buildings, you actually still need to provide fire routes and access to the buildings. And if you are in a situation where you need to put in a sprinkler system, now you need water storage on site. So are you doing that with a pond? Are you doing that with a tank in the ground? And then you will need a fire pump that is generally run by a diesel generator to power that sprinkler system when there is insufficient hydroelectricity there, right? One thing that has changed is farm repair shops. So specifically, there is a clause in the code now that dictates that all repair shops have to be separated from the remainder of a building by 1 hour if it's not sprinklered and 30 minutes if it is sprinklered, right? Materials used for fire separations now have to be under the Ontario Building Code. So previously with the National Farm Building Code, it was always materials that were listed in the national code that were to be used for the building. So now in this case, we're into the Ontario Building Code, which is going to require more use of non-combustible construction and elements that reduce the spread of fire. Flame spread ratings now come into effect with large farm buildings. So again, remember this is only large, over 600 meters squared. So flame spread ratings are basically how quick a flame will spread across the product, right? So in some barns, we know we use some plastic materials, right? So this will be the biggest thing that I see is that some of the poly materials that are used in barns that we use to keep the barn clean and washing, we now need to be careful about how quick the fire may spread on that, right? So it's a change, but it's not going to be too hard to overcome. It just means that you're into a product that has to have a rating that's proven, right? Majority of the polys that are used generally do meet this flame spread rating. So there shouldn't be too much of a concern there for anybody, but it's just something that you may be asked to provide. And something you need to be prepared about is that when a building official, we're just looking to prove that it meets, right? So your designer may have to just have the information that comes from the supplier of proving that this material meets the flame spread limits. Okay, so we're going to talk about fire alarms a little bit here now. So fire alarms may now need to be required to be installed in all unsprinkler farm buildings that are a G1 occupancy. So a G1 occupancy, that's our high hazards, right? Let's pick on a barn with liquid manure underneath, right? The trigger to requiring a fire alarm, though, is more than 25 people within it. You may get a barn that big, but it's gonna be hard for you to have that many people in a barn, even with the occupancy load calculations that are in the code. The next step would be a G2 or G3 occupancy. So a G2, that's our general buildings, and our G3 is the greenhouses. So now we're talking with more than 150 people and more than one story. So the G2, so those are both, that's an and there, right? So you have to hit both of those. I don't see a situation where we're going to have 150 people in a building unless you're proposing a use that is attached to a farm building. So unless you're providing a space that is more of an assembly use that's attached to a farm building, which it could now be permitted, that's when you may trigger a requirement for a fire alarm. Other new requirements for large farm buildings. So there's now a requirement for emergency lighting in spaces. An ag operation with a generator could be used as the emergency lighting. So if you're operating, if you have a barn or a facility that does have a generator on site, you could prove that your generator is sufficient to not needing separate specific emergency lights. There are conditions in here, and I didn't get to update the slide, but there are conditions that we know that in livestock areas, you may not need strobe lighting that comes with fire alarms or emergency lightings, right? Because we do have situations that we don't want the lighting. It could be in a greenhouse, it could be in a chicken barn, right? So it's only in areas that are meant for human occupation, right? Not necessarily where the animals will be. Travel distance from any point in the floor area to an exit. So previously, and actually still in the 1995 Farm Building Code, the distance to any exit within a building is 45 meters, right? So now this has been updated. So when you get into large buildings, so it's now 30 meters, which is around 100 feet, to an exit from a G1 with no livestock, right? So it's not a barn. 60-meter distance to an exit for a G1 with livestock or G2, G3 use that is not sprinklered. And 90 meters for a G2, G3 that is sprinklered, right? So sprinklering a building lets you get a larger travel distance to an exit. Portable fire extinguishers are now required in all large farm buildings. So all large farm buildings have to have fire extinguishers in them, and that falls under Part 6 of the Fire Code. Is actually where that comes from. Building code says into the fire code. I would talk to your local fire chief, local fire department there for that. Generally speaking, you need one about every 75 feet within the building. So if you have a very large, expansive barn, you may require multiple sides of the building to have fire extinguishers in them. So provisions for firefighting. So this one is tricky. You definitely need to talk to your local CBO and your local fire department prior to, right? So as large farm buildings are now under the Ontario Building Code, the Ontario Building Code has requirements for fire routes. This means all large farm buildings will need a clear 6-meter wide fire route from the road to the main entrance of a building. So depending on their location, existing roads existing roads within 15 meters of a building. So if you could use a municipal street that's already there. If you're within 50 feet, that can be considered one of your streets already. Okay. Um, Other requirements may come into this as well when you're thinking about fire routes is if you need a fire department connection for the sprinkler system, right? That's that Siamese connection on the outside of a building that you see. Water supply. Do you need a fire hydrant? Because if there's municipal water there, you may be required to bring a fire hydrant back to the barn or within 45 meters of the barn. And then fire pumps, which are pumps that are generally natural gas or diesel that will pressurize the sprinkler system when needed. So sprinkler systems, so certain large farm buildings will now require sprinkler systems. This will result in more requirements needing for firefighting, right? Uh, the biggest thing with sprinkler systems is you will need water on site. So again, ponds, in-ground tanks, and the size of this is required to be under the building code as the fire department needs approximately 30 minutes of water to start the fight for the fire, right? Essentially, what that does is that allows for them to show up with the water they have and the water on site, and then they can start their trucking protocols to maintain the water there. This is the standard that comes from all Part 3 and Part 9 buildings of the building code. So this is the standard that you need that 30 minutes for any building. Now, just keep in mind with all these requirements here is that sorry about that. Is that what these are large farm buildings, right? So over 600 meters squared, 6,400 square feet. Okay. Fire department connections are required on the outside of the building when we get into sprinkler systems, right? You need to maintain clear fire routes between the connection and the water supply. No equipment can be parked or stored near the doors and connections. And the same thing is the entire fire route laneway must be kept clear at all times. It's no different than when you get into a larger Part 3 building, like a commercial type building, there's a requirement for a fire route out front. We've all seen that. There's no parking signs listed there. And that's be similar for a farm building. Now, is a municipality going to require no parking signs along your fire route? That's up to each individual municipality. And that's where I recommend specifically having those conversations with your chief building official and your fire department. Anytime we get into fire alarms with any building, it really comes down to maintenance, right? So one of the things that I have the scariest thought about here is that if a farm building is going to require a fire alarm system, you know, is maintaining those devices connected to it. Heat detectors, whether in ductwork or heat detectors in a building or carbon detectors, if they get full of dust, they stop working, right? So it really comes down to a lot of maintenance required for an owner to maintain those devices, and they may need require inspections on a yearly basis. Um, they're sensitive to dust. They have devices in them. They're electronics, right? So keeping them clean is going to be hard. So occupancy permits. Probably most of you on the call here haven't heard about an occupancy permit before. So an occupancy permit is issued after the building permit. So prior to you being able to actually use the Building Code Act actually requires an occupancy permit to be issued. This became mandatory about 12 years ago, 12, 14 years ago in housing. And essentially what happened to the housing market is that this became a requirement. And then as it got phased in, lawyers and banks started requiring the occupancy permit to be issued prior to releasing money. Okay. So that is a trigger that I think would concern some, because I know I've been doing this for a long time. Majority of farm buildings, when they're built, when they start getting used, they're not at a point that we could issue an occupancy permit. But because large farm buildings are in the Ontario Building Code now, there's a trigger for occupancy permits. So you guys should be aware that if your lawyer or a bank is looking to complete the funds to a contractor, they may ask that the occupancy permit be issued prior to them releasing those funds. With that, it's hard. It's very hard because a lot of times the grading is not done. There's sometimes steps not done into a building for a farm building. Those requirements now have to be done. There's no way for a building department or for a municipality to issue the occupancy permit without everything being done. So it really focuses that if your financial institution is going to ask for that, then you're in a situation where you have to have all the grading and everything done around the building as well, not just the inside of the building. So that's a change as well that I don't think a lot have picked up. And it's something that it could become a problem for somebody down the road, right? So there was a transition period. This is now expired. The transition period was January 1st, 2025 until March 31st, 2025. And that was basically any projects that were substantially started with design work prior to the end of 2024 would be considered previous codes, right? And that allowed a little bit of flexibility, right, to bring in work and keep things going without having to meet the new code. Biggest thing to note is any permit issued currently, there is no change for you, right? The permit, the building code or the farm code you need to comply with is of the date of permit issuance. So that means no matter what happens from now on, if you have a project ongoing, it's that date of when the permit was issued. So prior to setting up here, OFA, Joanne and Duncan provided me with a few questions that had been given to them. So I have about 7 questions here that were already provided to me that I hope can maybe explain things. And one of the questions does talk about the new snow loading and seismic loading. That's why I didn't have anything else in the presentation. So I'll cover a lot of that up with that question. So can I design my own barn under the new code? Maybe, right? So under the new building code requirements are for large farm buildings, right? The Ontario Building Code is going to deal with large, and the National Farm Building Code is going to deal with the smaller buildings, right? And that's really the biggest delineation that has happened here with this coming into the Ontario Building Code is that delineation of large and small, right? So small farm buildings that are under the 1995 national, yes, you can still design under those, right? You can design your own building because it's not in the building code yet. So you can do it under the National Farm Building Code using SB 11 and all of your seismic, your snow loading, your wind loading all reverts back to the 1997 Ontario Building Code. But like I said, before you start any design work, have that discussion with your local CBO. Okay. We're not as scary as you think. Give us a phone call, have a discussion with us, right? Second question that was sent in is, do I need sprinklers, fire suppression in my livestock barn? Okay. So I know I talked about this a little bit before. So only in certain situations. So I tried to break it down a little bit more. These lines specifically here, this is specifically out of the building code, okay? So in certain situations, if you're over 3 stories in building height and you're more than 1,600 meters squared in area, then you may need fire suppression, right? Or if you're 2 stories, more than 2,400 meters squared, or 1 story, more than 4,800 meters squared in building area, and your livestock housing below floor liquid manure, grain elevators and or feed mills, and rooms for bulk storage or flammable dangerous reactive materials. For your G1 buildings, those are your requirements right there for sprinklers or fire suppression. For your G3 or your G2 buildings, it's if you get over 3 stories in height. Okay. So your G2 buildings, which is your general buildings, general farm buildings, there is a line in the building code. There is what's called a building classification that allows for any area still. So you're not limited to area with the G2. So it really comes down to is the height, over 3 stories in height for feed storage, equipment storage, animal housing, right? Work stops, fruit and veggie, milking centers, or animal exercise. Now that list doesn't cap there. That's just where I capped it at. There's more types of buildings that could be listed in a G2. So the need for fire suppression really hasn't done too much to too many farm buildings, right? And you can see that, especially with the G1, depending on the number of stories, you get increased in footprint, right? And that's the one thing I should point out here is that under the building code, when you're referring to building area is the footprint of the building, and your gross floor area is the total of all stories of the building, right? Do mezzanines count as a second story? No. Mezzanines are permitted in a farm building. However, they're required to conform to requirements of Part 3 as they're not listed or described in Part 2. So this is a little bit of just how it's a bit disjointed right now because there was farm building code requirements brought into the Ontario Building Code, but there's some gaps still missing. There's some cleanup that's going to happen and needs to still happen with that. We've recognized that. The province appears to have recognized that. So mezzanines are permitted, but there's no sizes of mezzanines listed in Part 2. So the reason I say this has to conform to Part 3 is generally an open mezzanine, which is a mezzanine that is at a floor level above that is viewable to below, right? So generally it's just protected with a guardrail. There's no walls. That is a maximum size of 40% of the floor area of the room or space it serves, right? If it's enclosed, meaning it has walls, then it's 10% of the floor area it serves. So yes, mezzanines are allowed. They don't count as a second story. Can I have multiple uses, occupancies in a livestock barn? Can a livestock barn be connected to a residential use? A lot of people have this question right now, and yes, this is something that has been brought in. Um, Obviously, there's some fire separations that need to be brought intact, and there's some other requirements, but these things can be done now, which is exciting news for a lot of people. So since the addition of farm buildings to the Ontario Building Code, different uses and occupancies are permitted to be connected to certain farm uses. So I put the clause here, right? Division B 2212, that comes out of the Ontario Building Code, states which uses are not permitted to be connected. So no G1 or G4 can be connected to an assembly, a care detention, or a residential occupancy, right? So but a G2, you are allowed to have some of those things, right? A G2, so G2 could be a barn. It could also be a repair shop. It could be equipment storage. Uh, it could be a riding arena. Those things can have a residential use connected to it, right? Now, the biggest thing to point out is that the main use should be the farm, and then the secondary use or the subsidiary use should be the residential, right? So you are allowed to have those connected now. That started January 1st. This is brand new. And it also allows for, you are allowed to have stores, so mercantile uses, office uses, and even assembly uses attached to G2 barns or G2 buildings, right? Do I need to do anything regarding snow, wind, and seismic loading? How does this work? Okay. So large farm buildings now under the Ontario Building Code have increased loading that align with other buildings in the Ontario Building Code. So this basically means now that large farm buildings have to comply to the same seismic, which is your earthquake, right? Your same wind loading and your same snow loading for the area of province that commercial buildings have to be built to, right? So yes, there is, depending on where you are in the province, right? Like here in Huron County and Lambton County along the lake, the seismic is very low, right? As you move towards Niagara and you get down to Norfolk and Haldimand counties and over up into Ottawa, the seismic loading is larger, right? So this is where, go back to the other question, can I design my own farm building? That's the situation when we get into the seismic loading and the snow loading. That's where you need to hire that qualified person, that professional to provide you with the math to ensure that these buildings are constructed to those new loads. Okay. Anything that was small, under 6,000 square feet, you are still back to the 1997 building code loadings, which is very little for seismic and lower snow loads. So the small farm buildings still comply with the 1995 National Farm Code of Canada for that, right? There's nothing needed to be done when designing buildings as so I just sorry. The one thing I noted with this question was there's nothing specific that you need to do to any existing buildings. I think I'm missing a word in my slide here now. I see it. That there's nothing you need to do to existing buildings. Existing buildings are there. There's no upgrading you need to do them. They exist and they exist as per when they were built and they have to meet the code of when they were built, right? Um, so since snow loading varies across the province, what you'll see is under the National Farm Building Code, low human occupancy, generally you were allowed to do 48 inches on center for trusses, right? Trusses specifically. So when you get into higher snow load, that's what the requirement is. You're going to see the trusses come down. Majority of the time, I'm seeing a new spacing that really isn't used in conventional framing is this 32 inches. So if you're into a snow load that's a little bit of an increase, that's what you might see is you might actually see trusses spaced down from 48 inches to 32 inches. Down in the southern part of Ontario here, uh, Leamington, Windsor area where the snow loads are very low, there may be no change, right? I know up here in Huron County where the snow loads are increased, especially the proximity to the lake, we are seeing that the trusses are spaced closer together, and that generally accommodates that increase in snow load. But there's nothing you need to do for existing buildings. This is only for new large farm buildings. So this question, and this is a great question because this is just a lot of different terminology that's used out there. So this question is, what is the difference between a fire block, firewalls, and fire separations? So I started with the bigger one first here. So a firewall are walls that are constructed to create two separate buildings. Okay. So essentially, you could have what looks like one building, but has a firewall divide it in some fashion. Maybe it's 50-50, maybe it's 70-30%, right? And that firewall has to be designed for a 4-hour fire rating. So, and that creates two separate buildings, right? They're considered two separate buildings under the building code. They're not considered the same building. So that's what a firewall is. A fire separation is lesser of that. So those are walls that are constructed within a building, and they're constructed generally to separate rooms or spaces within a building. The farm building code, the lowest rating, I believe, is 45 minutes, right? So that wall is designed to withstand fire from one side only for 45 minutes, right? These are used around mechanical rooms, service rooms, and one of the requirements we see now with repair garages is if a repair garage is unsprinkled, that has to have a 1 hour rating between the repair garage and whatever the other use is for there. Most cases, those repair garages have an office use for large farming operations. Fire blocks are something that's installed in concealed spaces, right? So in between wall studs, attic spaces, in concealed ceiling spaces that you can't get to, right? They don't have a fire rating specifically to them. So the code actually dictates what they have to be, right? So we think about in an attic space of um, larger equipment storages and such, or barns. We've seen this for years, is that there's a fire stop, which is a fire block put across on a trusses, right? So generally we use plywood or we may use sheet steel or something like that. And that is just to slow the spread of fire. That's what a fire block does. The fire block's not supposed to stop like a fire separation or a fire wall. It's just supposed to slow the spread of fire to allow for easier access for the fire department to control where the fire is, right? Um, the spaces for attics as well has been increased. So it used to be in some larger farm buildings, we had to split the attic two ways. Now we're actually in only into one way. It's over 100 feet. It doesn't matter the width of the building. So that is something that the province has increased the size of to allow for the spaces in attics of farm buildings. Question 7. So what is a boarding house and what is a bunkhouse? Okay, so a bunkhouse is not a defined term in the Ontario Building Code. So a boarding house is a structure that is less than 600 meters squared and has lodging for more than 4 persons in return for remuneration, services provided, right? So workers on site, right? And these workers don't have their own independent kitchens or independent bathrooms, right? You may share bathrooms, they may have their own bathroom, but they share a kitchen, right? Could be many different situations. So that's essentially what a boarding house is. Anything that is for 4 people or less is not considered a um, is not considered a boarding house, right? It's just basically considered a dwelling unit. So just remember that these boarding houses are not farm buildings, right? These boarding houses fall under Part 3 or Part 9 of the Ontario Building Code, and they don't fall under Part 2. So there really has been no changes for boarding houses or dwelling units on farms. There's been no change except now that they're allowed to be attached to certain farm buildings, right? So you could see we could see boarding houses now. We could see dwelling units that are attached to some other farm buildings, right? Less than 4 persons is considered a dwelling unit under Part 9. Both boarding lodging houses now within a dwelling unit will require fire separation if they are attached to a farm building, right? And I just put a note there. You just remember that's the thing. Like I know the question that specifically came to me was bunkhouse, right? And I know there's different acts, different regulations, different guidelines out there that may refer to terms like that, but that's not really a term that is used in the building code, right? So when you're talking about these things and specifically buildings, we just need to refer back to what the building code is and what those defined terms are. Okay, so we will move into questions. If anybody ever has a question, they can reach out to me if they want. I can put them in contact with their local CBO if they want or somebody else, but I'm always here if anybody has any questions. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and see what we have in the chat here.
Yeah. Um, so we'll go up to the top here and say we got Andrew who's saying that, hi, planning on building a hay storage barn using shipping containers for the outside walls. The building official has advised me that containers aren't in the building code, and this is a bit of a gray area. I know others have put up buildings using containers, and I'm looking for some input. Thank you.
Okay, so good question. Because I know everybody loves to use containers because they make it easy, right? Because they're like almost like Lego, putting them together, right? You set them down and then you want to build on top. So your local CBO or your local inspector who you were talking to isn't wrong that it's a gray area. There isn't anything covered in the building code towards shipping containers. So what you have to do is you have to think about the shipping container as one element of the building. So you actually have to hire an engineer to go and say that this shipping container can withstand this much load and then have the building designed with the shipping containers, right? So using shipping containers requires you to hire an engineer to say that these can be used as a wall. So essentially, they're no longer, once you do that, they're no longer shipping containers, they're considered walls, right? And then the engineer will address how you're gonna hold them down to the ground for wind uplift and how you're going to support them on proper footings and foundations.
Great. Monica asks, I have an accessory building that's 2/3 used for home businesses and workshops with a low occupancy, estimated at 24 people per week, and about 1/3 agricultural use. Does the ag part require a fire rating? So I assume that has to do with um, access to fire and safety and sprinklers and whatnot.
So So looking at this, so generally accessory buildings, we're talking back to residential use. So if it's considered a residential use to a farm building use, then I would say yes, you are required to have a fire separation between those two different uses there.
Okay. Um, a couple of questions between a few people. Um, Patrick and Katie, how are you determining how many people are in an ag building? And how does this extend to certain functions like farm tours? Noting that some farms will be using an ag tourism use, taking a tour through a livestock barn or some other type of barn. And in general, how does this interact with the maximum occupancy and its relation to things like the fire code, I suppose?
So that's a good question because we get into situations, and I know there's a lot of new, different types of schooling out there, and there are schools that are operating on farms out in woodlots, and there are schools that are coming to barns on a regular basis. And it could be varying schools that come to a barn on a regular basis. If there's a situation where a barn is designing a space, say on a second floor, for children or students to come and view how the barn is operating, then that portion of that building actually isn't a farm building now. That portion actually falls as a school which would be an A2 occupancy under the Ontario Building Code. So it's allowed, it can be done, but that's when you're going to run into these situations of needing fire alarms and needing more requirements for protection of public health and safety, right? Now, with that being said, um, every municipality has a zoning bylaw. So we need to be careful that you're complying with your zoning bylaw as well, right? Because not all zoning bylaws will say in their ag zone allows for these on-farm diversified uses or these agritourism uses. But they can be done. It's just there's going to be more requirements to protect the higher occupant load in there. Now, how do we determine the occupant load is, and the occupant load is the number of people in a building. That is determined generally by the size of the building and how many square feet per person in the building. Generally, with cattle, hog, chicken barns, those types of things, we're not going to count the animal area as an occupant load for people, right? So chicken barns are a great example because especially broiler barns, we get into a situation where it's mainly just area for the chickens, and then we have a couple small areas for people outside. Maybe there's a little office there, maybe there's just an area for showering or changing clothes, that sorts of thing, right? So that would have a very small occupant load because we're only going to take the area of the office up front as counting for number of people, right? Not the whole area of the chicken area, right? The livestock area. But no, it's the building code actually sets, and I should have put this in a slide here, but it sets how many people per square feet in a building. I don't think there's going to be a lot of situations where you run into getting into these higher numbers that require fire alarms. It's going to be really rare that a building hits 150 people to trigger that fire alarm.
Hmm. Okay. And springboarding off of that, Rick and Katie again are asking about older barns that are being either renovated or updated into a different type of use. Again, agritourism kind of comes top to mind for some of the members here.
So this can be done. What you have to remember is that when you're taking an older barn or an older farm building and you want to turn it into, we'll pick on the wedding venue, right? And you want to turn into a wedding venue, it's no longer a barn. It's no longer a farm building, right? So when you take it from there, you're moving it over into specifically a wedding event into an assembly occupancy, which would be an A2, right? So A2 is really the most general one because A2 covers schools, it covers community centers, and a lot of larger facilities to house number of people in them, right? So it's no longer a farm building. So then you're falling under part three as an A2. So that's when falling under part three, now, you may need to, depending on the municipality, they may ask you to do water for firefighting. You're going to be required to do fire routes. You're going to be required to do parking. And you're even going to be required to put this into barrier-free capacity, right? So essentially, barrier-free is that accessibility standard. The building code is very pointed in that when you do an extensive renovation of a building and taking it into an assembly use, you're going to have to make that barrier-free.
Mhm. Okay. Um, Erica is wondering, at what point in the construction process can you put animals into a barn? I think this might be in reference to the occupancy permit. She's discussing things like, say, the yard around the barn still needs to be leveled and the grass seeded, but the building is ready.
So, this is a gray area, right? Very big gray area in the building code because the building code is looking after, and this is me putting on my hat to interpret the building code to work in your advantage here. The building code really is there to protect the health and safety of the public, not the animals. So theoretically, you could put the animals in when the barn's ready. It's just people are not allowed to be in there.
Okay. Um, I don't know the author of this question. Uh, where can I find sources about pressure-treated posts that are agricultural grade and not residential grade?
Oh, good question. Yeah, there is varying different levels of what is ACQ lumber, right? Because you can get lumber in Ontario because we do have provisions for preserved wood foundations, and that is a different level of ACQ than what you'll find for residential. Generally, and that's the thing, most lumber supplies don't carry all the agricultural properties. You may need to find a lumber yard that provides those. And I know that it may be harder to define depending on your area. It means you have to source your lumber further away, right?
Hmm. Um, just going to make a quick comment on the time. We are coming up to the end, but we will try to accommodate all questions after we're done here. I don't know how much additional time Aaron has to keep answering questions, but
I can keep answering questions till they're done. Yep.
okay. Um, Stefan asks, any specific or special requirements around heat sources? Specifically, we make maple syrup with a wood-fired evaporator. Would the evaporator require any special fire separation in a new building that had other uses, for example, other farm product processing and or retail locations?
So this is a good question because the answer is yes, you may, but it's gonna and the asterisk to this question is the size of the building. I would say it's only going to be triggered if you're over 600 meters squared and considered a large farm building. If you're under that and still under the National Farm Building Code, then no, there would be no trigger for that. But definitely when you get into situations where there is fire or a fuel fired appliance, yes, they are required to be separated now under in large farm buildings.
Hmm, okay. Um, Katie asks, with relation to renovating old barns, what aspects of the code will the newer upgraded structure need to match, specifically things that are structural, like replacing posts and beams?
So in all cases, they have to meet the current code when you're doing work. So when work is happening in an existing building, you have to meet to the current code of the day. Um, so in this case, if you're under 600, it's the current National Farm Building Code. If you're over 600, it's going to be under the large requirements of Part 2 of the Ontario Building Code.
Good. Earl asks, did they change the building code for being able to design your own residential house, or is it just for large barns that you need to hire an engineer?
No, houses, you are still allowed to design your own house. So you're welcome to provide your design. There is a Schedule 1 form you have to fill out, and the third checkbox on the bottom of that form, you'll check off for an exemption and that it's homeowner design. So residential uses, yes, you're still allowed to design your own building.
Okay. Um, there's a couple of comments from Katie here. I don't see a question, though. They may have just been trying to clarify what they were talking about. Um, let's see. Matt says, if I were to add a viewing room or building to watch horseback riding lessons that will attach to a current riding arena, do you add the size of the viewing room to the current building to figure out the total square meters, which would make the new building permit above or below the 600 square meters, even though the viewing room would be much smaller than the 600 square meters?
Yes. Anytime you're doing an addition to a building, it's the increased size to that building, right? So if the existing building is 550 meters squared and you're adding 100 meters squared, that puts you at 650 meters squared. So then you're triggered into the large farm category under Part 2 of the building code.
Hmm. Um, Patrick said, refresh here. Patrick asks, are broiler chicken barns with vented radiant tube heaters still allowed?
Yes, I have not seen any requirements saying they would not be allowed, right? They would be allowed in the space.
Hmm. Yeah, I'll make a quick comment there that I have encountered similar problems and questions to do this as well. We I don't know if it's even resolved, but there was an issue to do with whether certain kinds of radiant heaters are actually allowed inside of confined spaces. And there was some disagreement in between the ESA and the CSA about whether they're rated for inside use. Do you know anything about that?
Well, I could see there being a possibility of a unit not being permitted to be used indoors, but essentially, I don't see an issue with, uh, I'll say a legal radiant tube heater being allowed, right? So yes, they would be allowed, depending on depending on the situation of the actual unit may differ, but yeah, it would have to be TSSA approved or a CSA approved unit in there.
Um, Katie has another question. Our barn is 100 years old. Most of the structure is post and beam. Some of it is 4 foot on center trusses and some on concrete blocks and walls. The renovations that we want, do they need to be up to the new code or can we use the old code?
They would need to be up to the new code. However, that's not saying that they have to be changed, right? You still may be able to do it as post and beam construction, absolutely. You'll just have to accommodate the sizing of them, right? Maybe if you're taking out a 10 by 10 beam, you may have to replace it with a 12 by 10 or something like that, right? But no, definitely, there's nothing saying it can't be done. It just comes down to what is needed there structurally to keep it safe and keep it standing, right? So it still can be done as post and beam, and you still may be able to keep it at 4 feet on center for the rafters. It just may mean some larger engineering for you for other elements.
Hmm, okay. Um, Craig asks, I noticed that pole barn construction in Western Canada is built on 2 by 6 or 2 by 8 columns with rot protection sleeves below the grade. Is this allowed in Ontario?
I'll be honest, I haven't seen it. But generally, it could be permitted. Yeah, the what the building code states is that you have to protect any wood that's in contact with grounds, right, or within 24 inches of ground. So any materials have to be rated for that. So anything you'd have to protect those 2 by 6s or 2 by 8s to make sure that they are essentially protected from the ground.
Okay. Paul asks, is there a limit to the number or amount of barns under the new code? To fall under that 600 meters squared, could I just have multiple greenhouses on my property?
You could have multiple greenhouses on your property. The trick is when they're attached, they're considered to be the same building, right? But you could have multiples. It's not limiting the number on a property at all for any type of farm building.
Okay, so as long as they're separate structures, if it's
Correct.
under that 600, then it would count under the 95, 97 codes.
Correct.
Okay. Um, Earl asks, can you build a 600 square meter barn and add an additional 600 square meter with a breezeway?
So that breezeway would essentially consider them attached, right? And consider them to be then, if you're 600, 600, it'd be 1,200 meters squared, right?
Mhm. George just wants to say thank you very much for the interesting and informative session. Patrick says, I have a 2,400 square foot broiler barn. If I want to add another 8,000 square feet to the barn, does the new code apply to the addition or the entire building?
Well, actually, that's a very good question, Patrick. It's kind of both. Structurally, only the new portion would have to comply with the new code. However, because the building size and depending on what else is required for fire alarms and sprinkler in those situations, those elements may have to be upgraded for the entire building. But Generally, for a chicken boiler barn, there's going to be no requirements for sprinklers in that. So there, in some situations, a farm building may have to be upgraded when there's an addition put on, but generally only the portion that's built is the portion that's comply with the new code.
Okay. And I think this is our last question, unless anyone has any burning additional questions after Matt's. Is there a minimum spatial separation distance from one building to another that makes them considered separate?
So the building code does have what's called spatial separation between buildings. This is a gap that has been missed, and there hasn't been listed in part two. Um, Generally, what we see is we want to see buildings a minimum 4 feet apart. When we're closer than 4 feet, that's when we get into fire separations needed and such, right? So it's a yes and a no. I suspect in a year or two we'll see that added in.
Muted myself there. We had a request for access to the building code. I provided them with a link. It is available online. I believe that you have to request it. It's
Yep.
not just a PDF you can download. You need to file a request and they'll get back to you.
Yep.
It's not hard. It's a huge document, so I don't recommend printing it though. Um, and we have Kate with one last question. Could one build a 1,200 square meter building with fire separation wall, creating two separate 600 square meter buildings, which would then put each building under the National Farm Building Code from 95?
So answer is yes to that question. You can, it's not a fire separation, that's a fire wall, right? The trouble is when you get into fire walls, you're limited to the number of openings through them. So fire walls generally can only have about 25% openings in them. So if you think of it's, and that's the length of the wall, essentially, right? So if you have a 100-foot wall, you're only allowed a 25-foot opening. Have that, with that being said, is the National Farm Building Code does not have anything about firewalls within it. So that firewall would then become a part two building on the Ontario Building Code. So what I would say as a CBO is that I would say half of your building would then have to be designed under part two, right? And then the other half could be designed under the National Farm Building Code. It's a tricky situation, but it could be done. And then you have to remember to construct a 4-hour firewall. Generally, you're into concrete or concrete block, right? So there's a large cost with associating to do a firewall.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Aaron. I think that's the end of our questions. We went 10 minutes over time, which is not too shabby.
Well, I appreciate everybody and some great questions. And if anybody has any questions, reach out to your local CBO or myself. Thank you.
Great. Thanks. All right. And thank you everyone for attending.